The guillotine was born in Revolution. We associate it with 1789 with the terror with Robespierre and the streets of Paris running red. We imagine it as a relic of that specific moment in history, a symbol frozen in time like powdered wigs and tricorn hats. But here's what most people don't know. The guillotine didn't die with the revolution. It survived, it adapted, it evolved, and it continued to function as France's primary method of execution for nearly 2 centuries after the last revolutionary tribunal closed its doors. The final guillotine execution in France didn't happen in 1794 or 1799. It happened in 1977, in living memory, when Star Wars was in theaters. Between those 2 points, between the Revolution and the late 20th century, the guillotine underwent a remarkable transformation. The wooden frame became metal. The public spectacle moved behind prison walls. The blade that once fell in crowded squares fell instead in pre-dawn darkness, witnessed by a handful of officials and journalists. The machine designed to democratize death became an instrument of silent, bureaucratic efficiency. Why did it persist for so long? How did a device so intimately connected with revolutionary violence become normalized as the standard method of execution for nearly 200 years? And what changed, technically, legally, socially, as the guillotine evolved from revolutionary symbol to administrative tool? This is the story of how the guillotine transformed across 2 centuries, how it adapted to survive political upheaval, technological change, and shifting attitudes toward death and punishment, and why France, alone among Western nations, kept the blade falling long after other countries had moved on. The first guillotine was crude by later standards. Built by German harpsichord maker Tobias Schmidt in April 1792, it was constructed almost entirely of wood, oak for the frame, beech for the uprights, elm for the bascule that held the condemned. The blade itself was wrought iron, approximately 40 centimeters wide and 30 centimeters tall, beveled at a 45-degree angle. The entire apparatus could be disassembled and transported in a large cart. Dr. Antoine Louis, who designed it, had tested the angle of the blade on corpses at a hospital. Earlier prototypes used a straight blade, but Louis discovered that an angled blade cut more efficiently through tissue and bone, requiring less weight and producing more consistent results. This seemingly small detail, the blade's diagonal edge, became one of the guillotine's defining features and remained unchanged throughout its entire history. The early guillotine was painted red, a color choice that had both practical and symbolic dimensions. Red paint helped hide bloodstains that inevitably accumulated on the wood, but it also evoked revolutionary imagery and the color of justice. This would change in later decades, but the revolutionary guillotine was deliberately visible, deliberately dramatic. During the Terror, from 1793 to 1794, the machine operated at unprecedented scale. In Paris alone, over 2,600 people were executed. The constant use revealed weaknesses in the design. The wooden uprights warped from moisture and blood. The grooves that guided the blade became worn, causing it to stick or fall unevenly. The rope that lifted the mouton, the weighted block holding the blade, frayed and occasionally broke at crucial moments. These weren't just mechanical problems, they were political ones. A malfunction during a public execution undermined the state's image of control and inevitability. The guillotine needed to work perfectly every time. These early failures drove the first wave of improvements. After the fall of Robespierre and the end of the Terror in 1794, the guillotine's role changed dramatically. Executions dropped from dozens per day to perhaps a few dozen per year. The machine was no longer an instrument of revolutionary purges, but a tool of criminal justice. This shift allowed for more careful engineering. The Sanson family of executioners, who held the position hereditarily, began documenting problems and proposing solutions. Charles-Henri Sanson, who had executed Louis XVI, was particularly insistent on improvements. His records from the Napoleonic period detail specific failures: blades that dulled too quickly, wooden components that rotted, mechanisms that required excessive maintenance. The first major change came around 1803, the introduction of metal reinforcements on the uprights. Iron bands were fitted around the wooden posts at stress points, preventing warping and extending the lifespan of the apparatus. The grooves that guided the blade were lined with brass plates, creating a smoother, more consistent drop. These modifications were subtle. To a casual observer, the guillotine looked the same, but they significantly improved reliability. During this period, the guillotine also became more portable. Napoleon's legal code had standardized criminal justice across France, and executions were now conducted in departmental capitals rather than centralized in Paris. This required guillotines that could be transported more easily. The wooden frames were redesigned to break down into smaller components. Standard sizes were established, allowing parts to be manufactured centrally and shipped to different regions. The color changed, too. The revolutionary red was replaced with unpainted wood or increasingly a dark stain. The guillotine was becoming normalized, bureaucratic, no longer a revolutionary symbol, but an administrative tool. This shift in presentation reflected a broader change in how the state thought about punishment. Less spectacle, more routine procedure. The July monarchy period and the Second Empire saw the most significant technical evolution of the guillotine. This was the age of industrial revolution in France. Ironworking techniques improved dramatically, precision manufacturing became possible, and engineers began applying industrial principles to state infrastructure, including instruments of execution. The critical change happened gradually between 1830 and 1850. The replacement of wooden components with metal ones. The uprights, previously oak reinforced with iron bands, became cast iron posts. This solved multiple problems simultaneously. Metal didn't warp with moisture. It didn't rot. It maintained precise alignment indefinitely. And crucially, it was much stronger, allowing for a heavier blade and mouton, which meant more reliable cuts. The blade itself was upgraded. The wrought iron blade of the Revolutionary period was replaced with steel, first carbon steel, then later crucible steel that could hold a sharper edge longer. The weight increased from roughly 40 kilograms to nearly 60 kilograms. The cutting edge was refined to a razor sharpness that earlier blades couldn't achieve. The mechanism for raising the blade also evolved. The original rope and pulley system was replaced with a crank mechanism that lifted the mouton smoothly and locked it in place more securely. This eliminated the risk of rope breaking and made the executioner's job less physically demanding. A single person could now prepare the guillotine for operation, whereas earlier versions required 2 or 3 assistants. Perhaps most significantly, the bascule, the tilting board that positioned the condemned, was redesigned. The new version tilted more smoothly, positioned the neck more precisely in the lunette, and locked more securely. This wasn't just about efficiency, it was about ensuring the blade struck exactly where intended every time. Precision became paramount. By 1870, the guillotine had transformed from a wooden revolutionary device into an industrial machine, precisely engineered, reliably manufactured, virtually identical across all of France. The most dramatic change wasn't technical but social, the end of public execution. For most of the 19th century, guillotines still operated in public squares, though crowds were smaller than during the Revolution and the atmosphere less carnival-like. But by the 1860s, a debate was growing about whether public execution served any useful purpose or simply brutalized spectators. The shift happened gradually. In 1832, executions were moved from the Place de Grève to the Place de la Roquette, outside a prison, reducing their centrality in Parisian life. In 1851, executions were moved to earlier in the morning, dawn rather than midday, reducing crowd sizes. But the decisive change came in 1939, when public executions were finally abolished entirely. The last public guillotining in France occurred on June 17, 1939, in Versailles. Eugen Weidmann, a serial killer, was executed at 4:30 in the morning before a crowd of hundreds who had gathered despite the early hour. Photographers captured the scene. A woman reportedly dipped her handkerchief in the blood. The images circulated in newspapers and caused such scandal that President Albert Lebrun immediately ordered that all future executions be conducted in private behind prison walls. This shift required new modifications to the guillotine. It had to be moved indoors, into prison courtyards. The apparatus was made even more modular and portable, capable of being assembled and disassembled quickly. The guillotine of this period could be transported in a small truck and erected in under an hour. The indoor setting also changed the atmosphere entirely. Revolutionary executions had thousands of witnesses. By the mid-20th century, executions had perhaps a dozen. The executioner and assistants, prison officials, a prosecutor, a defense attorney, a priest, and occasionally a journalist. Death had moved from public spectacle to bureaucratic procedure, witnessed by representatives of the state and recorded in official documents. By the early 20th century, the guillotine had reached its final technical form. The design was standardized across France, manufactured to precise specifications, and could be deployed anywhere in the country with minimal variation. This standardization is worth examining because it reveals how thoroughly the guillotine had been normalized as legal infrastructure. The frame was now entirely metal, typically painted dark green or gray, no longer the revolutionary red. The upright stood exactly 4.5 meters tall. The blade weighed 60 kilograms and fell from a height of 30 meters, traveling at approximately 7 meters per second at impact. These specifications were documented in official manuals and were identical whether the guillotine was assembled in Paris, Marseille, or any provincial prison. The blade was sharpened according to a strict protocol. The executioner, still a position held by the Desfourneaux family, descendants of the Sansons, maintained the blade personally. It was honed at a specific angle using whetstones of particular grits, tested on materials that simulated human tissue, and replaced according to a schedule based on number of uses, not on visible wear. This attention to maintenance ensured that the guillotine functioned identically whether it was the first execution of the year or the 20th. The entire apparatus, when disassembled, fit into standardized cases that could be loaded into a truck. Setup took approximately 45 minutes and followed a documented procedure with specific steps in a specific order. Testing was mandatory before every execution. The blade was dropped with a weight in the lunette to verify smooth operation. Nothing was left to chance. This level of standardization and bureaucratization is remarkable when you consider the guillotine's revolutionary origins. The device that once symbolized radical upheaval and popular violence had become the epitome of administrative routine, documented, tested, predictable, boring in its efficiency. The transformation from revolutionary symbol to bureaucratic tool was complete. The evolution of the guillotine paralleled an evolution in the role of executioner. During the Revolution, Charles-Henri Sanson was a well-known public figure, recognized in the streets, mentioned in newspapers, simultaneously feared and famous. By the 20th century, executioners had become anonymous civil servants, unknown to the public and forbidden from discussing their work. The position remained hereditary through most of the 19th century. The Sanson family held it until 1847, followed by the Desfourneaux family, who would hold it until 1976. But the nature of the work changed dramatically. Revolutionary era, executioners might conduct dozens of executions in a day. By the 20th century, France executed perhaps a dozen people per year, sometimes fewer. This meant that being executioner was no longer a full-time occupation. Henri Desfourneaux, who served from 1951 to 1976, worked as the executioner only when called upon, perhaps once every few months. The rest of the time, he lived quietly in provincial France, his neighbors unaware of his official role. The equipment was stored in a government warehouse. When an execution was scheduled, Desfourneaux would receive a telegram with a date and location, travel to the prison, assemble the guillotine, conduct the execution, disassemble the equipment, and return home. The pay structure reflected this occasional nature. Executioners received a small annual retainer, plus a fee for each execution. By the 1970s, this amounted to perhaps 2,000 francs per execution, a modest sum for a task that required traveling to the prison the night before, assembling equipment, conducting the execution at dawn, and handling all the psychological burden that came with the role. The anonymity was both practical and psychological. The state no longer wanted executions to be public events with identifiable participants, and executioners themselves preferred anonymity, given the social stigma that had always attached to the role. After World War II, the guillotine's days were numbered, though it would take 3 more decades to finally end. The post-war period saw growing opposition to capital punishment across Western Europe. Britain, West Germany, Italy, one by one, European nations abolished the death penalty. France was slow to follow, but the number of executions declined steadily. Between 1945 and 1977, France executed approximately 200 people by guillotine. Compare this to the 2,600 executed in Paris alone during the single year of the Terror, and you see how dramatically the scale had changed. Executions became rare enough that each one generated significant public debate. The condemned were no longer political enemies, but criminal offenders, murderers mostly, and occasionally spies during the early Cold War. The guillotine of this period was physically identical to the one standardized in the early 20th century, but its social context had changed entirely. It operated behind prison walls at dawn, witnessed by a handful of officials. Newspapers reported executions in brief notices buried in interior pages. The public had become squeamish about capital punishment in a way that Revolutionary-era crowds had not been. Several condemned prisoners became focal points for abolition campaigns. In 1972, Claude Buffet and Roger Bontemps were guillotined for killing a prison guard and a nurse during a hostage situation. The case sparked massive protest because evidence suggested Bontemps hadn't actually participated in the killings. In 1977, Hamida Jandoubi was executed for torture and murder. He would be the last person ever guillotined anywhere in the world. At this point, the guillotine had lasted 185 years, longer than any other execution method in modern European history. It had outlived the monarchy, 5 republics, 2 empires, the Vichy regime, and countless changes in law and society. But its time was finally ending. On September 18, 1981, the French National Assembly voted to abolish the death penalty. The vote was 363 to 117, a decisive margin, but one that revealed significant support for maintaining capital punishment even in the late 20th century. Justice Minister Robert Badinter led the abolition campaign, arguing that the death penalty was incompatible with human dignity and modern justice. President François Mitterrand had been elected partly on a promise to abolish capital punishment, though polls showed a majority of French citizens still supported it. This was a rare case of political leadership moving against public opinion on moral grounds. Badinter's speech to the Assembly was passionate and philosophical, arguing that justice should rehabilitate, not kill. With abolition, the guillotine became obsolete instantly. The device that had been standard legal infrastructure for 189 years was suddenly a museum piece. The last guillotine? the one that had executed Hamida Jandoubi in 1977, was disassembled and placed in storage. It would eventually be acquired by the National Prisons Museum, where it remains today. Other guillotines met various fates. Some were destroyed, some were sold to museums. At least one was acquired by a private collector. The French government was surprisingly unsentimental about these historical objects. They had been tools, not monuments, and once obsolete, they were treated as surplus equipment. The abolition wasn't just the end of the guillotine, it was the end of capital punishment in France entirely. Unlike some countries that abolished one method but retained others, France chose total abolition. There would be no gas chambers, no electric chairs, no firing squads. The blade that fell in 1977 was the last deliberate killing sanctioned by French law. In 2007, France went further, amending its constitution to permanently prohibit the death penalty. It cannot be reinstated without a constitutional amendment, a deliberately high barrier to ensure it never returns. So, how did the guillotine evolve from the French Revolution to the 20th century? The technical answer is clear. From wood to metal, from rope to cranks, from public square to prison courtyard, from revolutionary symbol to bureaucratic tool. Each modification made it more reliable, more efficient, more precise. By the time it was finally abolished, the guillotine had been perfected, which is to say, it had become exactly what its designers intended, a machine that delivered death with certainty and without variation. But the deeper evolution was social and philosophical. The guillotine was born in an age that believed justice should be public, visible, and equal. It survived into an age that believed justice should be private, bureaucratic, and humane. It adapted to those changing values by moving indoors, becoming quieter, operating less frequently. Yet fundamentally, it remained what it had always been, a machine designed to kill in the name of the state. The guillotine's long survival reveals something important about France's relationship with capital punishment. Other European nations abandoned execution earlier, often because they never developed such an efficient, standardized system. The guillotine's very effectiveness, its precision, its reliability, its apparent humaneness, made it easier to maintain. There was no scandal of botched hangings, no horror of prisoners surviving electrocutions. The blade always fell, the cut was always clean. This efficiency paradoxically prolonged its use. Yet that same efficiency eventually became uncomfortable. By the 1970s, the mechanical perfection of the guillotine seemed cold rather than humane, bureaucratic rather than just. A machine that killed without error began to seem more disturbing than methods that at least retained human imperfection. Thank you for watching this examination of how a revolutionary symbol transformed into an administrative tool and ultimately into a museum piece. If you found this evolution interesting, please like and subscribe. I'd love to hear in the comments, what other historical technologies outlived their original purpose? What does the guillotine's persistence tell us about how societies change or resist change? Until next time, keep questioning what endures and why.